This is such a beautiful game. Not only does Lasker literally invent a new tactic, his strategic play in this game is crystal clear. It's so obvious, and we can follow it ourselves. Now, his opponent isn't the best player in the world, but it's a good thing, really, that there's a disparity in their level because it makes the strategy that much clearer and easy to understand. This was played in 1889 in Amsterdam. Lasker had the white pieces. Johann Hermann Bauer had black, and Lasker begins with f4, a very modern kind of idea to play a sideline. This is called the bird's opening. Basically, white is playing the Dutch defense with colors reversed. His opponent plays d5, which is just the standard response in these types of positions, laying claim to the center. e3 is played by Lasker. He might play a classical Dutch type formation with d3 playing for e4, or he might play a stonewall formation with d4. We'll see. Knight f6 is played by Bauer, and here Lasker plays b3. Basically, he's playing for control over this e5 square, and one of the problems is that these three dark squares block the bishop at c1, so he fianchettos so that bishop after e6 gets on this very nice diagonal. And what Lasker is going to do in this game is basically just put his pieces in a position where they're attacking black's kingside. He just puts the pieces there and then attacks. Bishop to e7. He's got the one piece attacking on b2, so now he plays bishop to d3. Obviously, he's anticipating that his opponent is going to castle kingside, and we can see those beautiful bishops raking across those diagonals from b2 and d3. Really clear-cut strategy from Lasker. b6 was played by Bauer, and this is to develop the queen's bishop. It could go to b7 or maybe even a6 to trade off the light-squared bishop. After knight f3, aiming at the nice e5 square, he plays the bishop to b7, and now knight to c3. So we can see that the knight on f3 and the two bishops are in a position to attack on the king side. The only piece that's not really in position to attack is this knight at c3. Black plays the knight b to d7, castles, and castles. So with these three pieces ready to attack, what do you do, with the knight on c3? Well, Lasker shifts that over to the king side. Knight to e2, maneuvering his knight into attacking position and unblocking both of these bishops, aiming at black's king. Now, perhaps the best move for black was knight to c5, aiming at this d3 bishop in order to neutralize its attacking potential, but he plays the move c5. And this is sort of a real important learning moment, really, because what black is doing, he's not playing concrete chess. He's saying, I know that this is the formation I kind of want to set up, so I'll just sort of set up my formation. He doesn't really focus on the actual concrete reality on the board. He just knows he's supposed to play c5, so he plays c5. Lasker continues with knight to g3. And his idea is after the knight on f3 goes to e5, this knight on g3 can go to h5 and trade itself off for this defensive knight at f6, trying to maximize the use of all of his pieces. Queen to c7 is played by black, and then knight to e5. We talked about how this was a very nice post for a knight. And the best move for black here is probably g6, blunting the mobility of this light-squared bishop, making it, so it hits a rock at g6 instead of attacking h7. But instead, black goes ahead and captures the knight on e5. Lasker retakes with the bishop, gaining a tempo on the queen at c7. That queen moves to c6, lined up with the bishop, and it has some indirect pressure on the g2 pawn. Obviously, the pawn is his own pawn is in the way right now, but that could advance later. Here, Lasker plays the move queen to e2. Some thought that he should have played the move knight to h5 here, as he does later in the game, thinking that basically queen to e2 was the loss of a tempo, and that was proof that Lasker wasn't really calculating. He was just sort of moving his pieces. But those people were clearly wrong, because in this position, if white plays knight to h5, black can just play d4 and is already equal and beginning to build pressure on this pawn at g2. So the move Lasker played is the best move, queen to e2, setting it up so that the g2 pawn is defended laterally before he begins his attack. Knight to d7 might have been a little bit better than what was played in the game, but I don't want to go through that variation because you'll see the main tactic if you do. So he plays a6. This is a passive move, basically letting Lasker do what he wants to do. And you can see Lasker has basically 3 pieces already ready that are all ready to attack, and then even the rook at f1. And black only has really 2 defensive pieces at the moment. So knight to h5 is played by Lasker, and he's following a rule that Kasparov sort of talked about a lot when he was world champion. He wanted to get as many attacking units around his opponent's king as he possibly could and keep as many defensive units from getting over to protect it. And we can see white has many attacking units in this position. So black plays knight to h5. So with so many attacking units, you can begin to look for tactics here. And the first thing I'm sure Lasker checked for was a check. And here there's one check, and he plays it. Bishop takes h7, check. King is really forced to take the bishop. Now queen takes h5, check, and king to g8. Now Lasker has 3 attacking pieces, and it looks like his attack is petered out. If he tries to play a rook lift with rook to f3 after f6, black is just better. If bishop to b2, then d4. If he tries to sacrifice the bishop with rook to h3, black can just take the bishop, and after queen h7, g6, and the king just plays to e8 and hides. So how does Lasker continue his attack? You know there's something there with that many attacking units. Well, this is where you see the invention of the tactical concept. He plays bishop takes g7. This then became known as the classic 2-bishop sacrifice. He sacrificed on h7 and then on g7. After this, players started doing this on a regular basis, but before this, it was really unknown. No one was playing it at that time. The king really has to take on g7, otherwise, obviously, he's threatening the rook. Queen to h8 mate is threatened, so he has to take the bishop. So queen to g4 check, king to h7. If he goes to f6, queen to g5 is mate, by the way. King to h7, then rook to f3, threatening mate in 2 by rook to h3, blocking once with the bishop, and then that would be mate. But there is a way black can save himself from mate, and considering white has sacrificed 2 bishops just for a couple of pawns, black can afford to give some material back in order to survive here. So he plays e5, so the queen can come to h6 and block that check. He gives up the queen for the rook, but he has that other material. Rook to h3 check, queen to h6, rook takes queen check, king takes rook. And this is where we see how deep Lasker looked when he played the 2-bishop sacrifice. He didn't just see the king was vulnerable. He saw all the way to this point. He had to in order to justify the idea. And queen to d7 was his follow-up. A double attack, hitting the bishop at b7 and the bishop at e7. And there's no way for black to save both bishops. He has to give up one. So bishop to f6 was his choice. Queen takes b7. And now white has a queen and 2 pawns for a rook and bishop. The king comes back to g7. Now rook to f1. Lasker activates his other rook. Rook a to b8 hits the queen. Lasker doesn't mess around with this a6 pawn. He brings the queen back into attacking position so he can go after black's king. Rook f to d8, queen to g4 check, king to f8, and now pawn takes on e5. And that pawn is poisoned. He can't take it. If bishop takes e5, then queen to f5. Threatens mate and threatens the bishop. And there's nothing black can do. He plays f6, then queen can take the bishop because there's a pin down the f file. So he cannot take that pawn. He plays the bishop back to g7, but then e6, continuing to pile up pressure on this f7 pawn, pinned by the rook at f1. Rook to b7 to defend it. How can Lasker add even more pressure to the f7 pawn? That's right, queen to g6. really focused on that weak spot. So f6 is played, and so now he gives up his rook for a pawn and bishop. And looking at the queen and this pawn are very powerful. The king has to go to e8 after this check to defend the rook at d8. Otherwise, he would just lose it. King to e8. But now Lasker has a very nice tactical maneuver to win decisive material. Queen to h8 check, forcing king to e7, then queen to g7 check, and the rook is there on b7 to be taken. After king takes pawn, queen takes b7. And black played on in this position, but Lasker had a really cute last move I'll show you real quick. After rook d6, queen takes a6, taking on d4, h4 d3, and the cute final move from Lasker, queen takes d3. He doesn't care about rook takes queen, because obviously this is an easily winning king and pawn endgame. So Lasker shows a clear strategic plan of just aiming as many pieces at the opponent's king as possible, and then invents a brand new tactic in this amazing game. I hope you enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.